and the over 70 folks who have joined us online, registered for this event. I'd especially like to thank our alumni, students, faculty, and guests joining us this evening for this keynote presentation of our Impact Series during the Social Work Month. I also see we have some members of our visiting committee. Could you just sort of wave your hands? Yeah, so can we hear it for our visiting committee members? Now, I'm Dexter Voisin, and I'm Dean here at the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel School of Applied Social Sciences, and I have the distinct honor of providing leadership to this top school of social work and nonprofit management. Now, does everyone know what March is? What is March? Social Work Month, yes, yes. So I want to take a moment to thank our alumni and various contributors who provide human service, who provide important impact in human services and nonprofit sectors, and for all the many, many ways that you support our school, the students, especially in terms of their career development. Now, next year, we are at the cusp of a tremendous milestone. So what is this milestone? Case Western Reserve University was established in 1826. So that means next year, 2026, we will celebrate our bicentennial anniversary, 200 years in terms of making impact. We have many exciting activities planned during the year, and we hope that you would join us. Now, these festivities will culminate in the fall of 2026 with a monumental CWRU bicentennial celebration. So you'll be hearing lots more drip communication as we move along. Now, for tonight's presentation, I'd like to welcome our distinguished alumnus and keynote speaker, Mr. Howard Guttman. Howard? Yeah? He is a New York Times best-selling author and founder of Guttman Development Strategies, who has advised global powerhouses such as Walmart, Keurig, L'Oreal, and we're not going to leave out folks in the nonprofit sector, folks like YMCA and City Harvest. Howard is joining us from New Jersey along with his lovely wife, Jackie. Jackie, could you say hello? As well as his daughter, Michelle Sheldon. Michelle? And we had a lovely dinner and conversation last night, and when Amy and I went out to New Jersey last year, we met Howard, was absolutely blown away and said, we have got to bring Howard back to Case Western Reserve University. Next to Howard is Marilynn Gardner, who is the president and CEO of Navy Pier in Chicago. Now, Marilynn actually flew in this morning, and she's going to fly out right after this event. So she's coming in especially for this event. Let's hear it for Marilynn. So Howard and Marilynn are going to talk about what it takes to develop high-performance teams in organizations. And it's such a timely topic because we all live and work in organizations of some sorts. And throughout the presentation, he's also going to talk about managing conflict in high-performance teams. How timely a topic for where we are today. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Howard and Marilynn. Thank you.
So what I'd like to do is keep this very informal. I mean, anytime you'd like, you can interrupt, you can ask a question. But essentially, what I'd like to do in terms of goals is give you a sense of how we arrived at this point. What are high-performing teams? Why do organizations go down this road? And also the impact of my education at Case Western Reserve. It's fun to come back. It's like going back to the future. I mean, I graduated more than 10 years ago. So just to give you a quick picture right off the bat, I came to Case Western to go to the Graduate School of Library Science because I thought libraries would be a good base of community organization and outreach. After taking a couple of courses to be like the reference librarian, something that I wanted to shoot myself, and I thought, boy, did I make a mistake. But one thing that happened, though, is I was working with the Cleveland Public Library doing a needs assessment of the west side of Cleveland. And very clearly it came to me that I didn't know what I was doing. And I knew there was a School of Applied Social Sciences. So what I did at the time was propose a double degree and Terry Hoppenstadt, who was at the time the dean, approved it. And so basically what I was doing for 3 years in Cleveland was doing needs assessments of the Cleveland Public Library, the Huff area of Cleveland, the Greater Cleveland Neighborhood Centers Association, Veterans Hospitals, and it really became something I got very into. So that when I graduated, I went back to New Jersey, still in nonprofits, and then started to work in the profit sector doing assessments. So in the end, ironically, if I had not gone to Case to go to, the School of Library Science, this would never have happened. I'm sorry about that. Sorry, that's right. Sorry about that. So, to make a long story short, when you look now at my background, it really was coming from a place of nonprofit education, and then going into the profit sector. And now, as a firm, essentially we work all over the world, and we work with major corporations, nonprofits, educational institutions, but basically having them work as a high-performing team. And just to define that, I did not invent what a high-performing team is. I'm sure many of you know the name like Peter Drucker. He philosophically talked about it. And what he said many years ago was that, essentially, as companies got larger, it wasn't realistic to think you could have 1 or 2 people making the calls at the top. So he believed in the whole concept of distributed decision-making. Essentially, what I ended up doing was taking a lot of his precepts and started to apply them at ADP and then Johnson & Johnson. And when I left J&J, I started my own firm. So when I think about my social work education and where it helped me, like dramatically, the first is just getting a sense of how do you analyze macro systems, communities, large-scale organizations. I mean, and Professor Yankee, who was really my main advisor at the time, we'd spend many hours, although I'm sure you don't remember now, but thinking about how do you deal with resistance? How do you deal with like communities that have warring stakeholders? The second was to do needs assessments, whether it be around doing surveys, focus groups, individual. How do you validate it? The third was feedback meetings. So going into hostile territory, telling politicos what the needs of the community were and having them say to you, I don't like that data. I'd like you to minimize the data. And we'd have conversations like, what the hell are you talking about? That's what the data says. So dealing with resistance. And then finally, how do you manage stakeholders? So essentially, even though I did not know it at the time, I took this education and then I applied it to the firm. And one of the things that I really feel very strongly about, and in meetings today with folks from Weatherhead as well as SAS, there's a process orientation that's deeply needed in the profit sector and the nonprofit sector. But you're dealing many times with folks who don't get the plot, meaning they have a technical orientation, a content orientation, but from a process standpoint, they don't know how to somehow push past resistance, gain stakeholder alignment, and so consequently, many times inadvertently, as they go higher up the ladder, they literally sabotage the very organization they're leading because they're unconsciously incompetent. So there's a real opportunity. Well, yeah. So there's a real opportunity ultimately to think about how do you evolve the educational experience, including field work, to have folks add far greater value and expose them to a world that right now they don't know exists. So when you look at our current practice, this is basically what we do. We do a lot of organization development, setting up these high-performing teams in companies around the world. We do a lot of coaching. We coach well over 100 executives who typically are technically very strong, but they need help in how do they manage resistance? How do they manage conflict? How do they enroll the organization? How do they deal with the board, stakeholders? Leadership development, and we're a diverse firm. So basically we reflect the world out there. And many times in consulting, you have to really think about what's going to play in that world. And so what I mean by that is that sometimes they'll want a man, sometimes they'll want a woman, sometimes they'll want somebody of color. I mean, people are that specific to say, this is what I think is going to play. So after you get into the issue of skills, the question of how do you enroll that organization, that client company, so they feel like you get the plot, is really an interesting proposition. We're women-owned, as my wife has the power to fire me, and we have many backgrounds in the firm with a high preponderance of social workers and people from psychology. So many times what we'll do is we'll follow a consulting firm like a Bain or a McKinsey. We'll do a merger, let's say like Keurig buys Dr. Pepper. So McKinsey comes in and assesses the financials, how's the thing gonna work? Then we come in and we start to align the senior team. We start to align R&D, marketing, et cetera. And many times these guys will leave and they'll say to us, boy, you'll love it here, there's so much crap here, because they're focusing on the top line. We're dealing with the stuff that's ultimately gonna make or break it. So ways of working, interdependencies, trust issues. And frankly, when you look at the world today, and we talked about that last night at dinner, when I was in the corporate world in the 80s at Johnson & Johnson, you'd be working for like 3 years, everything would be okay, and a regime change would come in, things would get shaken up, people would freak out a little, and then everything go back to normal again for the next 3 years. So you'd hit periodic speed bumps. Today it's a world of speed bumps. And I would tell you that the competitive landscape today is tougher than anything I've ever seen in my life. And we were talking about the fact that there are certain businesses we work with, like food, the margins are slender. Categories like wine, beer, coffee are cratering. So you have company or higher ed, where enrollments are tough. So in many cases, our clients have to work as high performance organizations just to be in the game. So this isn't like a nice thing to do. We don't get brought in by companies that say, I want you to come in and help us empower our people. It's more that they want to have some type of competitive advantage, and they recognize that if you work as a horizontal organization, an interdependent, high-performing team, you're going to have a major competitive advantage over a siloed, hierarchical hub and spoke. That's really what it comes down to. So, again, when you look at the practice, and you think about a high-performing team, just to define it here. Hold on. Thank you. So this would be seen as a high-performing team. So if you think about your own organization, the first is that people are clear around the goals, the priorities, which is kind of black and white. The second is they have the right players, but notice this. This presumes technical competence. It presumes that like the clinician knows what they're doing, that a marketing person knows copy strategy. That's kind of like duh. The pitcher can pitch, the first baseman catches. But you notice the caveat is they can influence across without positional authority. That's the concept of working horizontally. The third is that I'm aware of my role, what yours is, and I know when we pass the baton back and forth. The fourth is what's best for the enterprise supersedes the functional self-interest. The fifth is how decisions are made is clear. And let me be clear about that. There's 3 ways you can make a decision in a high-performance organization. Unilateral decisions are the ones I make every day without getting other people's opinion. Like if I'm marketing and I'm doing copy, I'm not going to go to the finance people. No offense to finance people. The second is what you'd call consensus. But consensus isn't agreement. You can't run a company on agreement. We couldn't have agreement on what we want for dinner tonight. Consensus in a high-performing context means that I might not have chosen that pathway, and I can live with it. And I can live with it. So you're lowering the bar. What comes up the most is what you'd call consultative decision-making, whereby I solicit input from the fewest number of people who add value. So the 2 caveats are fewest for speed, to not have a bureaucracy, and it's based on value add, not positional authority. So now, when we work in nonprofits, and again, I'm making broad generalizations, but so be it. The need to let's include everybody. Everybody's got a point of view. Nobody's point of view is better than somebody else's. All this bullshit. And it creates dysfunctionality in the organization. And under the guise of trying to honor people, respect people, have them feel a part of the game, they inadvertently sabotage the very mission that they're extolling. And so you get it on an emotional level, but again, rather than push into what I'm talking about, they stay within a certain comfort zone because they don't know how to navigate it. So consequently, what you end up having many times is what you'd call like a tyranny of consensus. And eventually they come up with the decision based on who's still breathing, who still cares, who's still in the room. The sixth is that the team works like a managing board. So any issue is fair game. If marketing is concerned about finance, they have the conversation. If the clinician has a concern about what's going on in HR, they have the conversation. But means number 7 is they can depersonalize conflict. That's the real key. You cannot have a high-performing team without being able to engage in constructive conflict resolution. And again, not to throw stones, but because many social workers want to accommodate. They want people to be okay, which is a nice aspiration, and it ain't real. If you want to be a player in an organization, you're going to have to challenge the status quo. And every time you do that, you may be ruffling feathers of people who established it. So the question is, can I challenge the status quo, ruffle the feathers, have the conversation, and still make the relationship work? That's the game. So everything I'm talking about, like high-performing team, this is not a natural way to work. What's natural is you come into an organization, you think about what you've got to own, and you're not thinking about how do I hold these people accountable. So you have to construct this. So when they bring us in because it's counterintuitive to work this way. Just one last point, then I'll give it to Marilynn. So again, this is generic, but when we go into an organization, there are certain predictable stages of going from working hierarchically to horizontally. Again, and when I say horizontally, so think basketball, right? That's a good sports metaphor. Versus track. So other than the total score, sprinters don't intersect with the pole vaulters, right? That would be a hierarchical siloed game. I'm talking basketball. So the first stage, testing, is when there are issues there, but we don't want to go there. For whatever reason. You don't want to piss people off. You don't want to damage relationships. It's like Emperor's New Clothes. Stage 2 is we put the issues on the table, but now there could be some tension and discomfort because now we're providing feedback and we hadn't done that before. Every organization on the planet Earth bounces back and forth between stage 1 and stage 2. If I put out my point of view and I'm met with resistance, maybe I'll go back into the closet again. If I'm met with acceptance, maybe I'll keep pushing my toe a little further. Stage 3 is where we set up a new game. This is where you're establishing accountabilities, ways of working, etc., so people understand what's permissible. And finally, stage 4 is high-performing team. The reason you see those arrows is every time you bring in a new player, the team regresses until you integrate the new player. So when you're looking at a high-performing team again, the fact of the matter is that it's not necessarily a foregone conclusion that a team's going to morph into a high-performing team. It's predicated on the coachability of the players. So the last slide I'll show you is in terms of what's the secret sauce. So this is what it takes to create a high-performance culture. The first is obviously you've got to have a client. And when I say a client, like somebody who's willing to go where they got to go. So for example, if somebody's conflict averse, but there are issues that need to come on the table, they're going to be willing to do that, even though they may get butterflies. The second is you have to have people shift their mindset of what does it mean to be accountable. And let me show you what I mean by that. So in a high performance, everybody can read this? I took pains to make this very clear, all right? That's why I did it ahead of time. So the first level of accountability is you take accountability for you, which is a positive. I take personal accountability for my job. Very good. The second is I take accountability for my people. That's also very good. But that's not a high-performing team. That's a silo. Now, it's a foundation. You want it, but that's not the game. High performance starts at level 3. That's when I take accountability for my peers. The fourth level is I take accountability for my leaders' success. In a hierarchical mindset, far be it for me to give them feedback. In a high-performing context, I'm at stake, I have a stake in how I'm being led. And then finally, the fifth level is I take accountability for the enterprise. It doesn't mean I insert myself into other functions, but what it does mean is if I see a cross-functional issue, I'm going to at least flag it. I'm going to have a conversation with my cross-functional peer
And I'm at least going to try to think about is how do we land the plane on that? Now, what tends to happen is this is where people have the highest degree of control. Becomes more of an influence game. So when we're going into an organization, the third thing we're doing is we're teaching people how do you influence without authority? How do you have the difficult conversations? Because you can't go from stage 1 to stage 4. We're trying to cascade best practice ways of working. We're trying to shift systems to move people in a particular direction. And finally, the top 2 levels need to play. So every time we go into an organization, we know what to do on paper. But the question then is, do you have players who want to play? So what we're always doing is qualifying, do we have a client? So let me just stop at this point right before I give it to Marilynn. Any quick question on any of this? Yes, go ahead.
With the recent climate, not just in the past couple of months, but just with so much corporate change and turnover, right, and mergers and things like that, how are you seeing a higher level of corporate distrust? So, you know, a number of years ago, this is my career, I'm going to work here for 30 years, I'm going to retire out. And now it's such turnover. And sometimes the organization's doing, sometimes it's the staff. So there's this distrust now of organizations I see that say, I'm not going to do this because they don't care about me.
Well, first of all, I completely agree with you. I mean, when, let's say my colleague Greg is over there, when he and I were Johnson & Johnson, Johnson & Johnson was like next to holiness at the time, you know, where you think like, wow, I'm at Johnson & Johnson. That's about as good as it gets. And I keep my nose clean. Someday I'm going to get the watch. Everything's going to be okay. And now, by the time the early 90s came, that mythology kind of went away. And so to your point, when I think about organizations we work in today, whether it be profit or nonprofit, people tend to have like a foot in and a certain degree of a foot out because they recognize that this isn't necessarily forever anymore. So from a career management standpoint, you see people trying to create a broad network of folks beyond the 4 walls of their organization. That wasn't necessarily the case many years ago. That was your family. But people recognize now that it's, you know, it's kind of like a fool's game. But the only other thing I was going to say, though, is that we do a lot of work with private equity, with mergers and acquisitions. And even though these guys are sharks, the one thing that is interesting, though, because they deploy us all the time, is they still want to win. So they know the game's got to be functional. Now, their motives might be because I want this thing to be okay, and 4 years from now I'm going to sell it. So I want it to be pretty. So they don't care how we make the sausage. But it's ironic in a way that they really press to have these high performance organizations because they know it's going to increase the likelihood of a win. So it's kind of funny in a way. Where I have probably the more challenging aspects is when we work in nonprofits or when we work in education, because there's a mythology that as long as we're all mission driven, coming from the same place, and I think I told Dexter this a while back, that a month and a half ago, I'm in this big nonprofit talking to the CEO, and we collected the data to kind of benchmark where the team was, and the data was terrible. And then he said to me, he said, but you know, Howard, I'm for kids, and everybody in this company is for kids. And I believe as long as we're all kids, we're all for kids, I think it's going to work out. I mean, wouldn't you agree? And I said, well, I think there's a lot of BS. So I said, but I understand your point of view. So what I'm simply saying here is if you really want the game to play, you got to really play the game. And you've got to deal from a place of authenticity, which many times doesn't occur for whatever reason in a nonprofit sector. So I'm going to stop at this point, and we'll be engaging more. But Marilynn, you want to talk about Navy Pier?
Maybe I'll come over here, right?
Certainly.
Okay. Great. And is this one still on? Yes. Okay, perfect. All right. Well, good evening, and thank you, Howard, and thank you, Dean, for including me. I am, in fact, one of Howard's clients with my team, my leadership team at Navy Pier. So a brief introduction. Again, my name is Marilynn Gardner, and I have the privilege of serving as president and CEO of Navy Pier. I just recently celebrated my 30th year at Navy Pier. So It's been quite a ride, and I'll fill you in a little bit about about my background, as well as a bit about the history of the pier and where we're going with Howard's partnership. So how many of you have been to the pier?
No,
Great to see. Okay, terrific. Well, and for those who haven't been, I highly encourage you to come see us, and please let me know when you do, because it's a truly special place. So, as I said, I'm the president and CEO. I joined Navy Pier in 1994 before its initial redevelopment and reopening to the city and to the world, frankly. So the pier was originally opened in 1916 as a shipping and recreation facility, held many different purposes, or served many different purposes over the years, including a training facility during both World Wars. It hosted or held a jail for draft dodgers, and also a site for the Red Cross. And then it served as the interim school for University of Illinois in Chicago prior to Circle Campus opening. And those who attended school there fondly referred to it as Harvard on the Rocks. So it has such a rich history in Chicago. And when I joined the team, I came to Navy Pier with a journalism background, always intending to be a newscaster or a newspaper journalist. Thankfully now, as those things are going to the wayside, I did not choose that path. I joined the team at Navy Pier as the public relations representative as we were launching Navy Pier. So I was the one sharing the story of Navy Pier with the world. In 2011, I had the privilege of leading the transition from the then government agency that owned and operated both Navy Pier and McCormick Place. I led the transition to an independent nonprofit. And though Navy Pier had seen great success with its original redevelopment, at the time we were told by the experts that the pier would draw 4 million annual guests at peak. We exceeded that in our first full year of operations, and now see more than 8 million guests on an annual basis. And just last year, so coming out of pandemic and really rebuilding ourselves, we saw 8.5 million guests last year. And we're so proud as an independent nonprofit now. And again, I never would have imagined that my journalism degree would lead to nonprofit management and leadership, but it has. And I think I have been able to bring to it a lot of the skills that Howard has been talking about. We've seen great success. In the 90s, we far exceeded anyone's expectations. But the pier has had to continually evolve and adapt to the times. And so transitioning to the independent nonprofit really helped shift the lens of how we better serve the community. So under my leadership since 2011, we have transformed the pier physically, programmatically, and organizationally. We have invested with our partners more than $400 million in that redevelopment. And when I say with our partners, we engaged an outside private development company, a developer, to invest $120 million in a hotel that opened up during the pandemic. We have a marina, a transient boat docking marina that will open this summer, and that is all private investment. Navy Pier, as an independent nonprofit, the dean was asking me where our revenue comes from if we're not supported by government. Well, 90% of our revenues are earned from our operations. 10% are contributed through philanthropy and through partnerships. So I have a highly effective team with whom I work, but I think one of our rubbing points or issues was I instinctively and implicitly trust and respect each of the leaders who work directly for me. And think about it, we're a 365-day-a-year operation. We operate 24/7. We have a pristine safety and security record. We have welcomed guests from across the street and around the world, consistently provided exceptional programs, but we still have work and growth and opportunity ahead of us. So going back to the nonprofit, one of the things that we've been able to do now after we've transformed the pier into a world-class civic space and a resource for our community, we are the home to 70 independent local businesses. So we're a business accelerator for local businesses, and many of them have started at the pier and now gone global. We are proud to connect artists with audiences. We have 400 free programs on an annual basis where our audiences, our guests, are able to see arts and cultural performances and all different genres of art up close, things that they might not otherwise be able to afford a ticket to see. We do a ton of community outreach. My goal is to ensure that every sixth grader has had the opportunity to visit the pier. There are so many students and young people in our city who have never even been to our lakefront. So we have this jewel that we have transformed, and our role is to share it with others. We are one of the top employers of youth in the city, and we provide financial literacy training and opportunities for growth and really create a network for those individuals and share them with the community and vice versa. So truly, it's an honor to be a nonprofit leader and to think about what's next. We just recently were on the tail end of completing a strategic plan. Howard mentioned working with McKinsey. We have been working with McKinsey on a pro bono basis, thankfully, and they are helping us reimagine the pier for the next 10 years. And what will it take? So we're at a very pivotal point right now where we're thinking about who are the right players? Who are those team members who are willing to work together to take us to where we need to be? So right now, our work with Howard, I would say if we went back to Howard's graph of the 1, 2, 3, 4, we're still playing in 1 and 2 and going back and forth and are eager to get to 3 and 4 and beyond. But there will be, and Howard and I just talked about this earlier, we'll be looking at a complete transformation of the organization as well. And we're doing this at our board level too. I have a board of directors as well as an associate board. And we're looking at who are the right leaders? Who are those individuals who now can take the Navy Pier of today to the Navy Pier of tomorrow? And so it's an exciting time and a time of transition and transformation. And our work with Howard is certainly not done, but it's been terrific so far, and we're looking forward.
Can I add one thing,
Yes,
Marilynn? Because
sure.
I think it's an important point. Is if you go back, I was just looking at that slide. So in a high-performing team, the ability to have authentic conversations and depersonalize is the key to conflict resolution. So I'm going back to what Marilynn said. In a high-performing team, and we talked about like this, so the next time we get together with the team, people assessing like, do they have the stuff to take the pier to the next level, which isn't always a given.
Right.
That's the level of authentic, transparent conversation that needs to occur. And again, going back to what I said earlier, that's somewhat counterintuitive. If you're coming in an organization, and going back to the point that you said around economic dislocation, when you're in a time of scarcity and people don't want to lose their job, to have that level of conversation is not easy. But that's essentially where you got to go.
Right. And I think I was sharing with Howard earlier, I've seen that now in my leadership team. I think after our conversations as a team with Howard, I've had a couple of my C-suite level employees say, so once we get our strategic plan into place, it's on each of us as individual leaders to determine, am I the right fit? Am I what this organization needs to go to the next level?
So what we'd like to do is really engage in and open it up for questions and Q&A. So, questions. Even if it's not a really good question, I'm going to pretend like it is. So,
All questions are good questions.
they're all, no, yes, well, they're not really, but we'll make believe they are. No, but any questions at all? Yeah, go ahead.
So you've talked about having a coachable client. For clinicians, you might have to let some clients go at some point. So how do you acquire a client, and what is a great client?
I don't think he said I was a great client, or we were.
Well, but it's a great, it's a good question. Let me start with the second part. In starting to work with Marilynn and Navy Pier, we were completely open with one another. I didn't feel like there was any sacred cows. So when I think, going back to the issue of like having a client, you got to have a client who's more committed to having the organization work than their own ego. And she exemplifies it. She's committed to it working. And so even in the course, going back to the second point, and when I think about that first session we did, where you and I were talking constantly offline,
Right.
and so she was willing to take a leap of trust. Nothing bad would happen, even though you're getting some very challenging and sometimes difficult conversations where they hadn't gone before. So to me, it's around coachable client, dispensing with the ego, and willing to foster a climate whereby not only is it permissible, but it's expected that people are going to be honest with one another. And the other point you asked, which is yes, there have been times we've fired clients which I cringe. It's the last thing I want to do. But, there's an old line, and it's a good line, which is that the only thing that's worse than having no client is having the wrong client. It's really the case. And if that happens, it destroys your brand. Because then people feel like, you're in it for, just the bucks. So in the end, we qualify clients. We have to.
I was just wondering, I remember saying this in my graduate work, but have you thought about a new strategy as far as dealing how to incorporate this with the new technologies, AI, and dealing with the next generation?
Yeah, well, it's funny you say that, actually, because we are going down the road of AI. You see, because our focus is the top 2 tiers of an organization. They don't spend the money on us to go down to like supervisors, shop floor, particularly in the big companies where they have thousands of people. So looking at the doing like virtual coaching, et cetera, so we can, now many times what we'll do is we'll train people internally to take it down. So we do train the trainers and stuff like that because we can't go down to that level. So yes, something like an AI could be a very viable tool. And in fact, very shortly, right, we're going to be looking at what a template actually looks like. So it's exciting. In fact, if you go on our website, you can see like the early avatar of me, answering questions. I have hair though. No, I don't have hair. That was a joke.
And for any of our virtual viewers too online, we do encourage you to type your questions into the chat and we will read them out loud. And for any other questions in person, please raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone to you so the virtual folks can hear it as well. Thank you.
One thing while you're delivering the microphone, I do think so important, Howard, the organization first is such a priority. And I think that's something that maybe we weren't as focused on prior to our work together. And it's something that we're really looking at the board level and at the organizational level as well, that, it absolutely has to be organization first and everyone working in that direction.
Yeah, and the other point that you mentioned about today is like, you go into organizations today and there is a lot of fear and there's a lot of trepidation, shortly, obviously in government there is, so there's a sense of dislocation. And I can't think of many organizations we work with where they feel like they're immune or they're on high ground. So there's a certain like stress factor that starts to come in. But in the end, what you're attempting to do is, rather than have people hide out and play more of a victim passive aggressive game, the goal is to have people be able to actually articulate that as a team. In fact, I'll show you, if I can do one quick model just to show you. Since they were nice enough to get me a flip chart, I have to use the flip chart, right? So going back to the issue of conflict that the dean mentioned, you've got basically 4 options to deal with conflict. The first option is you can confront it and attempt to change the game. The second option is you can let it go, and thereby you're changing your perception. The third option is you can leave. So if I'm not happy with my role, I can try to renegotiate it with my leader. I can let it go, but letting go means, like I say, like c'est la vie. The job's not perfect, no job is, but I'm not doing like psychodramas in my head when I'm driving the car. I don't think about it when I wake up, like it's gone. The third option is I can split, I can go. The fourth option is I can go underground. And this is where I pretend like I'm okay, but I'm not okay. So when you think of a time of economic dislocation, you have a lot of people that have emotionally quit and they stay because you're frightened. So getting to the point where you can create an environment where people feel like it's permissible and safe to have those conversations is crucial. Because the problem is that if you don't do that, you create like a pressure cooker in an organization. You have people who are going underground, and then what they start to do is enroll other people because they don't want to be alone. And then what really becomes dysfunctional is when new people come in who are okay, immediately the message they're getting is, well, you really don't get it. And then they're enrolled too to be dysfunctional. So when you look at creating a high performance environment, part of it is around creating an atmosphere whereby people feel like they can be real versus living a facade because it's too dangerous. So frankly, going back to what we're talking about, and it really comes down from going back to the issue of a client. So you've got to have a client who recognizes that in fact, I'll give you a great example. I was at a town hall meeting a couple of weeks ago. CEO has like 200 people in the audience. I was standing by the stage listening. Somebody asked a question, and the CEO goes, "Oh, blank." No, nobody could hear it, but I could hear it. And then he takes a deep breath and he says, "That's great. That's exactly the type of courage I want in the company, blah, 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 blah." Anyway, after the whole thing's done and we're talking, and I said, "I heard what you said." He said, "Yeah, the last thing I want to do is hear that question." I said, "But what you did was very cool." So what he recognizes is really an important point. Versus reacting emotionally to something he didn't want to hear, he intellectually thought about what would a high-performing leader do, and he did it. So it's the same thing for myself. I don't lead the way I always want to lead emotionally. I lead around what would a leader do if they were really playing a high-performance game, and then I do that. So it's really important to recognize that you have to be intentional to keep your eye on the prize. And to me, my code is I try to create a high-performance organization, which means I'm not always going to be happy. And if people challenge me in the organization, even though I don't want to hear it, I'm going to take a deep breath and be cool. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. So I have 2 questions. The first is, what is the long arc of, I'm drank the Kool-Aid on this. And, most of, at least this country, was not brought up in a culture where, if you go back to lower school education, kids don't have the agency to tell their teachers or challenge them or question them, so there's a long arc to this being authentic and being able to navigate conflict in a meaningful and useful way that doesn't involve attacking people, but it's a skill, and we're not teaching it yet at the lower levels, or maybe even, I went to grad school here, not here, but another college at Case, and this wasn't part of our discussion, and it seems very clear to me like this needs to be. And I look at companies, I'm in the job market right now, I look at companies and I see like the top companies, they are operating under these theories, at least ostensibly. And the ones that aren't doing so well absolutely would not want somebody like me, who's going to name the elephant in the room. And that's my other question. I hope I don't offend anybody, but I'm curious to know if you find a differential on this theme of it's first the organization before my position or my ego. Do you find a difference between male and female leaders on that topic?
Let me take the first question first, okay? Remember this when you said like the arc. When we go into an organization, we're not trying to create, this isn't like the Russian Revolution, right? There's still a pecking order in the company. But here's the distinction. In a high performance organization, if I work for you versus you're my peer, there should be no difference in the conversation, except if I work for you, you've got positional authority. So you could say, you know what, Howard, you're saying black, I say white, and I don't want the negotiations over. That's the only thing positional power should get you. Other than that, it should be the exact same conversation. And you're absolutely right about the fact that, these skills aren't necessarily taught. That's why what's kind of ironic to me is that what we do in universities, or not universities, excuse me, if we go into an organization, work with like the C-suite, I had this notion when I was younger that by the time you go up there, you're dealing with like the gods on Mount Olympus. That was...
Not so much.
Right. That was shattered years ago for me. Go like, wow, they're not okay either. None of them are okay. And so you end up having somebody who is like, a great marketing person. They become the CEO. They still pretend like they're the marketing person and they don't know how to lead their team. So there's a real interesting distinction you start to get, that you're trying to create a team of leaders versus trying to create like some cult of personality around one individual. And you're absolutely right on the other point you said. If in the end there are some leaders who don't want to play, that's real life. But there is a correlation in the data, and you see it all the time. In fact, even like McKinsey, although I'm not such a big fan of McKinsey, but you look at McKinsey data, teams that work as a high-performing team, a horizontal organization, in terms of speed of decision-making, issue identification and resolution, communications, it's obvious data. That's why people bring us in. Innovation. Right. But you gotta have somebody who's conscious enough to get the plot. That's what you gotta have. And so, going back to what I said earlier, we really are, we assess that. And so in working with Marilynn at Navy Pier, we talked quite a bit before the gig, and then after we collected the data to determine like, where do we hold them or fold them, right?
Right. No, it was a very active, ongoing conversation. And again, there's still work to be done, but it was very effective in bringing to light the things that we all needed to do as leaders within the organization.
Right. Yes, sorry.
Dexter's asked that I introduce myself as well. I'm Susan Lapine. I also have a degree from, I have the MNO degree, so it was the sort of leadership management program here, which I loved. And I did go into nonprofit leadership, and now I'm in business. So I've kind of done the cycle that you have. Marilynn, I'm interested in your thought process in deciding that you needed this kind of coaching, because the chronological slide that you had looked for all the world like you were doing extremely well, growing enormously, making great changes, and recovering from COVID and et cetera. And the numbers that you gave when you introduced yourself were pretty impressive. So what was your thought process in turning to someone for?
Well, I think Howard said it early on when he was doing his introduction, that as organizations grow and evolve, there's need to, especially as they get bigger and bigger. Now, the peer, as you saw on the slide, we went through during pandemic 2 layoffs. We went from 60 full-time employees down to 17. And then we are now at about 42 full-time employees with growth on our horizon. And I have absolutely the strongest operational team, I think, put us against anyone in the city or in the country. But every individual who reports directly to me is extremely high performing. And like I said earlier, I trust implicitly each of them in their, and especially in their roles. They are truly the experts in each of their areas. So as we were working with an executive leadership coach on some of the conflict resolution and, very strong personalities, pushing back on each other and things, it naturally progressed to working with Howard, and just really we were seeing kind of this rub of individuals versus organization, and with growth on the horizon and need to think about where we were going, because we were taken to our knees during pandemic. But we saw during that time frame, we raised $9.5 million from individuals, foundations, and organizations just to reopen our doors. So this was a much different narrative for us. It's a space we had never truly gotten hold of as a new or a nonprofit in our infancy. So time for growth, time for real assessment of who we are and who takes us forward.
You know, what's interesting. Is it me? Is that me or you? Okay. What I was going to say, what's interesting is that back in the 80s, when I was in the corporate world, when you talk about like coaching, the people who got coaching were seen as like broken people, the last ditch effort to fix them before they went to outplacement. I mean, seriously, it was for broken people. What's changed today is companies don't invest money in broken people. They invest money in people that they really believe can really contribute and add value. So the whole paradigm of executive coaching has shifted from dealing with dysfunction to really how do we accelerate and take somebody to another level. It's a major narrative shift. So in many organizations we work in, they see executive coaching as a gift, like that the company values or the organization values them enough that they're willing to invest money.
No, and that's a great point, that it wasn't necessarily dysfunction, it was growth and need to continue to evolve the organization.
Right.
And I hate to do this, but my ride is here to get me to the airport.
Oh.
So, go ahead. Yes.
Students who graduate from our program with either the MSW or the MNO, what skill set do they need to say to you when they come and sit down and put their resume, CV in front of you that says, this person has the skill set to work at our organization?
Emotional intelligence. Look me in the eye, have the conversation, share who you are, show your person, like, don't be afraid to be yourself. But the thing that I've seen so recently with young people is they're so detached, and they need to look you in the eye to engage, to really show who they are and show up as well. We, as an organization, we are in the business of bringing people together. And it was quite a struggle to, post-pandemic, get everyone to see that and understand if we're not together in person and leading together, it doesn't work. So, you know, and I think we have a responsibility to the young people coming up to mentor them, and to those, you know, in the moment conversations make such a difference. So, so be present, be engaged, and show up.
Thank you, Marilyn.
Thank you. I'm so sorry to have to leave. Thank
no,
you.
thank
But
you.
please reach out. You have my contact information, and send your young people to us. Thank you.
Thanks, Marilyn. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Can I ask a quick
The only,
question?
the only thing I would add to that, David, is like when you and I were, when we were talking this afternoon, to me, the issue of coachability is that hidden competence that people don't talk about, but that willingness to take a leap despite the fact that it might be counterintuitive to someone's comfort. That coachability issue, when I look at when people derail in organizations, they don't tend to derail because they're technically not good. They derail because they don't know how to build and sustain organization support. So going back to what Marilyn said, there's a lack of EQ or a lack of coachability, and eventually at a certain point they implode.
So I have a quick question.
Yeah.
How do you encourage your clients, once you get them on the good path of high performing, to infuse those values into their other partnerships and collaborations?
Could you say that one more time?
So I know she left, but I'm thinking about the idea of having numbers of partners and collaborators that a company has. How do you encourage them to be leaders in terms of infusing the values that they have now garnered related to high performing teams? How do you challenge or advise them to be leaders in their other collaborations and partnerships? Because that's sometimes a place where you bump heads. You build up this high performing team, but then you're in close affiliation with other entities who are not. And how do you start to change the tide, if at all?
Yeah, so I'll give you a real life example of that. So in dysfunctional conflict resolution, there's a term called like triangulation, which is right where if I have an issue with John, but I don't talk to John, I talk to Diana, Diana talks to John, and you start creating this passive aggressive underground world. So what happens many times in organizations, like many times, is like a board member will talk to somebody in the staff complaining about another staff member, and in a high-performing organization, the staff member would say to the board member, so it sounds like you need to have a conversation with Frank. You're going to have the conversation. What are you going to do with that? They would be holding that person accountable. So when you're creating a high-performance organization, you're rebranding what does it mean to be a player in that organization, and you're raising the stakes of what functionality looks like. So you're not willing to abide by dysfunctional relationships. Now, when you get into things like funding sources, board members, I mean, I'm not naive. I recognize it's like, getting into like some high stakes poker in terms of the implications. But the problem is that if you don't do that, you really begin to sabotage your brand as a leader. So I'll give you another example. Client, head of sales, organization, 35% of their revenue is based on Walmart. The guy who's head of sales, misogynist. They've had many issues in terms of like what would have been like EEOC violations. They're terrible. But Walmart loves this person. And I remember being with the leader of this organization at a bar, and we're having a drink. And he's going like, he says, geez, sometimes I feel like I sold my soul to the devil. And I go, you did. I said, because at best, people feel like you don't see it. So at best, you're blind. You're unconscious in people's minds. At worst, you do see it and you don't care. You're like a prostitute. So at best, you don't see it. At worst, you don't care. I said, that's selling your soul from a brand standpoint. So one of the challenges in a high-performance organization is you're paid to model what does high performance look like and what does that mean from a values orientation, because you're exposing yourself. You're really raising the bar on functionality. So the stakes raise for everyone, and it's harder to hide out. But what's plan B? playing an underground. I mean, like, what else are you going to do? So that's why what I said before, we're not being brought in by like these benign people who are like highly evolved all the time. We're bringing people who want to win, or they want the organization to succeed, or working right now with a current nonprofit they're working with where their funding sources are drying up, and they've really got to think about how do they enroll the rest of the organization. And going back to like Navy Pier is a good example where Navy Pier is a successful place. Other clients of ours, like Keurig Dr. Pepper, successful company. It's really about how do we take it to another level? Because left to their own devices, be given the economic backdrop, the reality here is that they're looking for something to hold on to, and that something is the human factor. Whereas maybe in the time I was around in like the corporate world, it didn't matter as much. And then when you work in a nonprofit or a smaller organization, the challenge there is that everybody counts more. In the big companies like a GSK, yeah, you could have The Walking Dead, it doesn't matter, because they have an army of people. The smaller the organization, everybody's got to count. So, as I said before, like the water level is rising, the stakes are rising, and you can't afford to allow for a lot of dysfunctionality. It's really what it comes down to. Yeah. Go ahead, Dexter.
So Howard, over the past 5 years or so, this buzz phrase, authentic leadership, has gotten a lot more public attention. But how people operationalize that or their personal meaning of that, there's a lot of variation. So someone might say, hey, I talk about my personal struggles, or what I did on the weekend, I'm an authentic leader. What is your definition of an authentic leader? And could you talk about how your journey with that concept has changed over time?
You always ask these tough questions, Dexter. No, the first question around the authentic thing is interesting, is that there was a colleague of mine once, and he said something I thought was very profound, and he said that work is a behavioral rental agreement. That's what he used to, and he'd say, you're basically paid to exhibit certain behaviors for that 8-hour period of time, and then you can go back home and do whatever the hell you want to do. But then you got to show up the next day and do the same thing. And so when we do work, the context is around work, right? I'm not going in there, we're not doing like group therapy, because it's just simply how to maintain functionality within the organization. So being authentic in that mind, represents to me two things. One is, well, in fact, let me go back to this. One is this issue of number 6, I own it all. I own it all. If I see it, I call it. Not that I wait for the boss to do it. If I see an issue, either a tactical issue, a person, whatever it is, I'm going to bring it up. I'm going to play like an authentic game. I'm not going to collude with dysfunctionality. So when I think about like authentic leadership, it's like whether people in my organization agree with me or disagree with me, and they whatever they do, at least I want them to know that I'm straight, they can count on me, what I'm saying is what I believe, and there's no facade, there's no gamesmanship, for better or for worse. And so it requires a certain degree of willingness to put yourself out there. Now, that doesn't mean every issue is worth fighting. Again, going back to this, there are some things you can choose to let it go. But when I mean, Greg, you might want to add, I'd be like, but if you had to define authenticity, what would you say? Since we work together, I might as well put him on the spot.
Well, being authentic right here. So it's being who you are. One of the things that Howard taught me years and years ago is you have to be who you are. And when we worked together at Johnson & Johnson, I give this example because back then I was 23, 24, 25 years old, and I'm only 30 now. But anyway, at that time, Johnson & Johnson was a pristine, waspy organization. Blue suit, white shirt, red necktie, black shoes, black socks, standard fare. I was a big black guy with a beard. And Howard said to me, you're going to stand out like a sore thumb. So what do? You are who you are. And so in that environment, I then dummied down my personality to a degree because I didn't want to come across as an angry black man. Although I could be sabotaging at certain times the circumstance and sabotaging myself and the company by not giving authentic, real information because I was masking who I was. I've learned, and what he taught me was, you are who you are. People will like you or they won't like you. If you dummy down yourself, hide behind some facade, you're only sabotaging yourself and the situation. So be who you are. Say what the facts are. Stick to the behaviors that are real and true, and then you'll come across as being authentic.
But sticking to the behaviors is a crucial indice. When you're dealing with conflict situations, if you want to be in that zone where it'll work, it's about, in my mind, sticking with behavioral feedback and demonstrating empathy to try to understand how your words are landing on somebody. If you can do those two things, it'll work. And you can talk to anybody. But that requires, though, again, a willingness to not judge, get a way of typing folks and thinking on a behavior. And what we do is basically focus on a behavioral plane all the time. That's all we do. We don't stray from that, because that's when you get into trouble. And you've also got to demonstrate enough empathy so that people actually get that you actually give a damn of how your words are impacting them. So many times we do work in conflict resolution in really tricky scenarios. But if you can stay with behavior, you'll be able to land the plane. And it's not easy for people to do that. Yeah.
Having worked in a corporate setting,
You go ahead. Sorry.
but I can add to that, having worked for a corporate setting for 21 years, and part of it is with authenticity, and I've had it on both sides of the fence, right? Being consistent and equitable with it. So when you talk about this board of directors, are they following through with everybody in the same manner? Or is only one person's voice being heard and applauded? So I think, you know, to Greg's point, if you're wearing the mask and you're playing the game and not being you is going to show up somewhere. And a lot of times karma comes back to that person and says, nope, we're not putting you in that role because you haven't shown your authentic selves when we're trying to be a high performing team. And you see that a lot. So it kind of feeds into a question I have for you. We know that it's also about profit, and it's about gain of people wanting to rise to the top of their game as well, right? How do you break somebody from that monetary goal mindset completely to more the social emotional goal of buy into, I need you to buy into this if you want to get to that other place?
Challenging. Why don't you give me like simple questions? No, it's a good question. It's a good question, but but again, it's around. It's like, what are you owning? What's your intention? When I look at number 6 as an example, if you're playing a game of what's best for the organization, ultimately people are going to see that. And I'll give you a great example. Working with this senior team, they didn't hit sales for 2 quarters in a row. One of the people on the team said to the sales guy, look, I have to tell you, I'm beginning to feel a lack of trust because you've been saying that you'll be able to hit the mark. You haven't been able to hit the mark. And I got to tell you, I'm beginning to, now this wasn't the boss. This was a peer. He said, so I'm at stake for you to win. What do we need to do to support you? What does that look like? So he's coming from a place of what's best for the enterprise is ultimately going to filter down. So you're talking about people who, rather than focusing on their parochial self-interest, one of the values you're trying to extol in the organization is an enterprise view. So again, when I think about a high-performing team is not about just my own patch. It's about what's best for the enterprise. And if you do that, you'll win. If you play the other game, like a siloed game, like we're playing poker, like we get into head count conversations, resource allocation, and I'm trying to think about like what's going to be best for my own patch, you lose. So it's like, what are you playing for? Like, are you playing for the game of all, or are you playing for you? And in a high-performing team, you're playing for all. Because frankly, it becomes very obvious when you're not. You were going to say something.
Yes, I promise this is going to be my last question.
No, these are good questions.
Okay.
I was kidding. I like challenging questions.
Okay. I don't mean to be contentious. However, there have been a plethora of federal laws that are being changed right now, that have been changed. How do we get the team to have stake, as well as the stakeholders, as well as the public, to get everyone on board still, to bring everyone together to work as a unit and to survive and thrive?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And if I can go back to my magic board here again. So we're working right now in an organization that is hurting. Thanks, Greg. Now, again, this is not scientific. This is just from experience. So when we go into organizations, you tend to come across, like, in my mind, three types of individuals. You have the players, who are the people who are seeking out new vistas, challenging the status quo, really wanting to move the ball ahead. And you have, like, the vacationers. And these are the people, look, it's not my life, it's my job. You know, new boss comes in, particularly in the government, there's loads of people who are vacationers. And then you got the prisoners. And the prisoners are like the angry vacationers. So they don't like the ride, but they stay, you know? So the goal in creating a high-performance culture is to incent people to be players, to try to tip these people over, and you eliminate these people. Now, again, that might sound harsh, but if you're playing for real, not everybody makes it to the promised land. And if you don't hold these people accountable to play, it's impossible to incent anybody else. So the toughest nut to crack when we go into an organization is, what do you do with the people who play the underground passive-aggressive game? And so, to your point, in the time of economic dislocation, where people are frightened and feel like they don't have power, you have many people who seek a lot of refuge over here. And so if you really want to change the game, you got to hold up a mirror, let people know that you see it, try to understand what's in it for them to play that way, and have the discourse. And that becomes a team issue. That would be a high-performing team. So a high-performing team ultimately would, here we go. A high-performing team would have that conversation. A stage one team would see it, but they wouldn't want to bring it up. They don't want to hurt people's feelings, or they empathetic. I understand. And they collude with it. The stage two team would be like very aggressive. So what I'm saying is creating the space to actually have that conversation and see where people are at in a safe way is like, that's like foundational.
I agree. I'm just saying, I'm talking race, LGBTQ, I'm talking the whole spectrum, that we just got to a point where everybody's starting to kind of gel in a sense, and now it's all being swiped out from under our feet.
Right, but then I get it. I mean, but then you still come back to this issue of people still have got four options here. So I say to somebody like, great, so you still got four options. Are you going to have the conversation? Are you going to deal with it? Or are you still going to play? You can't let it go, right, because you're in the middle of like a war. But should be verboten. So what I would do, as opposed to collude with it, I would incent people to say, like, what's it going to take for you to play? Because frankly, there isn't a good plan B. What's plan B? Playing like a victim game? There's no mileage there. So these are tough conversations, but this is what I'm saying is these become team conversations, organization conversations. So you're trying to create an atmosphere where that's permissible to do. Because what's the other alternative? And I'm saying to you, even when I think about organizations we work in where there's going to be a reduction in force and people aren't sure who's going to go, a couple of months ago I was in an organization and people actually declaring where they were, what their comfort level was, who wanted to stay, who wanted to go. There were like some tiers. So creating an atmosphere where those type of conversations are permissible is crucial, because stage one is the kiss of death. That's when, and because frankly, if you ask most people walking down the street, what's the most dysfunctional stage? They probably say stage 2, because infighting sounds like a harsh word. The fact is that the reason it's stage 1 is that's when people check out. That's when people disengage. And in today's world, I'm less concerned about the infighting and the tension. I'm more concerned, like the point that you're raising, of people just saying, screw it, disengaging. That's the kiss of death in companies. It really is. And in today's world, it takes a higher degree of energy and a higher degree of acceptance to be willing to put those conversations on the table. But that's really what needs to happen, rather than have it be behind closed doors. And I know it's not easy, but again, like what else are you going to do? Other questions? Yes, go ahead.
Hi. So I have worked in a variety of fields, and I've worked at organizations where they have been high performance organizations, and I've worked at organizations that have had pretty toxic cultures, and I've felt psychologically unsafe in terms of that organizational culture. For someone who's kind of on the lower end of the hierarchy, how do you encourage people to be able to either move up within an organization that maybe doesn't have, or that has the potential to be a high performance organization, but you might not have that availability to kind of challenge some of the barriers that are in place? Does that make sense?
Because why not?
Because of your order with, or where you're at within the hierarchy. So even thinking about our students, if you're starting out within the field, how do they work their way up? Especially if maybe they've shown their value and shown their worth. However, maybe the organization isn't functioning well enough, and so they maybe aren't seen for their potential.
All right. So let's say, assuming you know that, right? Because obviously you got to be able to know that. You're dealing with an interesting mindset issue where folks who have, let's say, like a core limiting belief of the lack of power they have, or the lack of ability to affect change. The conversation that needs to occur foundationally is around what that core limiting belief is, and if they're to make them conscious of why are they choosing that role, and to think about how do you start to coach them with alternative actions. So I'll give you an example, okay? And I think maybe we talked about this, where I did a keynote at this business school, and about a week before I was supposed to do it with this VP of HR from a company, the dean called me and said, I just want you to be wary when we go into this thing in the grad school, because there are certain color words I don't want you to say, and this and that. And immediately I thought, oh, geez, I don't want to deal with this. And I said, like what? And he said, well, there are certain things, if you say like, victims or this and that, people get pissed off and blah, 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 blah. Now, obviously in my mind, I was thinking to myself, well, that's great. Now I'm going to start like looking for opportunities. So here's what happened. It was really fascinating. I think, Dexter, we talked about this. So there's 200 people in the audience, faculty, students, etc. This guy who is from India said, we're talking about a lot of, and he said, I'm living in a house, and because of my language barrier, people like talk over me. They don't give me time of day. I don't feel comfortable here. I don't feel safe there. I said, I get it. I said, so what part do you see yourself playing in creating that circumstance? He said, what do you mean? I said, well, you're talking to me like lightning bolts are coming from the heavens, and you're just like being buffeted by it all. I'm saying, what part are you playing in creating that circumstance where you feel a sense of dislocation, invalidation, lack of empowerment, blah, 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 blah? And he said, well, I don't necessarily always say things when people do that and that. And I said, okay, great. That's a great start. I said, so what you're saying is part of the dance that you're in is, rather than call it when it gets uncomfortable, rather than call it when people are running roughshod over you, all you do is like kind of keep collecting evidence that it's not a safe place. So what I'm trying to do ultimately is, and so what ended up, I said to the audience, I said, does anybody not see that? Now the dean, I was saying, who was in the front row, she was going like that and making herself crazy, but people did get it. It's just that under a guise of attempting to be supportive and not invalidate, inadvertently sometimes you start to collude with it and commiserate, and you're not really moving that person to a different place of understanding. So I'm not disagreeing with the fact that they may be boorish, aggressive, riding roughshod, not listening, but he still is dancing with that. So where the power comes in is to think about what part can somebody play to start creating a different level of circumstance. So when we go into companies, that's literally what we're always doing, is thinking about, what do you own here? What part is that? How do you blah, 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 blah. That's where power comes from. Lack of power comes from, what the F, I can't do anything about it. These things are happening to me. And so I get the point that in a time like this, that's challenging. But if you're really at stake, literally at stake for somebody, for like that level with your peers, that's where the coaching comes in, if you're really at stake.
Howard, could you go back to the slide about influence skills? What we teach is influence. We're teaching you, if you don't have positional power, this person that he was speaking of didn't have the power or authority to change the environment, but he had influence skills if he knew how to use them. So what we do in organizations is teach that influence skill so that people will have it and be able to manage through conflict that's not easy to deal with. I'm not the president of the United States, so I can't decree certain things, right? But I do have influence if I use it and know how to use it, if I'm conscious of that. So in an organization, there are oftentimes people who are who's a manager dealing with the vice president, for example. And it's, well, I'm just a manager, that's the vice president. I can't possibly overrule what you can influence that vice president if you're a manager, if you have the skills and if you are conscious of it.
Yeah, that's why I said earlier, or maybe I didn't say it, but there's an old Bob Dylan song which is like, you got to serve somebody. This isn't the Russian Revolution. There is a pecking order in any organization you work in. But that still doesn't mean that you can't still choose to assert, even though I recognize sometimes it could be feeling like you're going into harm's way. But that's when you have the options, And so what I'm saying here is that, going back to this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to teach people, how do you have the conversations? How do you land the plane? And how do you let it go? We're not teaching people how to leave because, although actually, it's funny. So years ago, I did this presentation, and I remember saying this. It was in this big United Way thing, and I said this thing, and this woman stands up, and she said, I don't agree with you. I said, what do you mean you don't agree with it? She said, I don't believe that people know how to leave. And what she meant was people don't necessarily know how to leave cleanly. And when she said it, I went like, whoa, that was I got it. She's right. But ultimately, the question for people is, are you willing to try to renegotiate an influence? Can you choose to let it go? Do you need to find another world for yourself? But this is what doesn't work. And so my fear and my provocation when I think about many times social workers inadvertently, in an effort to make someone feel safe and secure, many times they collude with this. No differently than in corporations, HR people do the same thing. I mean, they try to be like a safe space. Someone's acting out dysfunctionally. It's like, well, you got to understand who they are. It's like, that doesn't work. That's why this work isn't necessarily, it's challenging. But again, what else are you going to do? Other questions?
That actually does conclude our portion today that we have for Q&A. So I am going to interject at this time. I do encourage all of you to stay if you have an extra moment. We do have the space reserved till 7:30. So if you do have another question, please connect with Howard after.
So this is part of our long-term series in terms of impact talks. I want to invite you April 1st. I'm going to be doing a all virtual presentation entitled Proud to be Mandel. And we're going to talk about some of our recent accomplishments as well as our upgoing strategic initiatives. So I'm inviting all of you to join us April 1st. We'll send out that link. So once again, we want to thank Howard. We want to thank you. We want to thank the folks online for joining us. And we're going to conclude today's program and invite you to continue fellowship and the reception. So again, Howard, thank you. Marilynn. And thank you for coming.